Welcome back to the Brando and Joe podcast. We have two guests today, first time ever, John Zager and Dr. Sai Islam. Welcome, guys. Thank you for joining us.
Welcome. Thank you for having us.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah, absolutely. We have an interesting topic today, MBA versus IO program. I'm actually excited to talk about this because for our past listeners, we've brought this up a couple of times. I think we probably brought it up in your each individual episodes. This is like the trilogy. Like we could like sell this episode in like a trilogy box set. But it is an interesting topic. We got to talk a little bit about it at the Houndstooth Pub, our alumni event. And especially because this podcast is geared towards students. When you come out of undergrad, like everyone's like, all right, if I want to do business, but I want to get my extra degree, there's like kind of two options. We have the MBA and you have a master's in IO, and there's probably others that I'm forgetting, but this relevant for us. And just so I'm correct, Dr. Islam, you got your MBA first and then your master's in IO.
Yeah, so
correct?
the story is that I learned about IO in my MBA program for HR management. So that's really where.
Okay.
So before the show began, we were talking about how we have some difficulty like promoting the field. This is the ultimate like story of not knowing anything about a field that I really like until I got into an MBA program, right? So and luckily Fairleigh Dickinson had a dual degree program where you could kind of pick and choose the courses, and it wasn't as long as doing both degrees separately.
Okay. That makes it's actually interesting that you found that like during
Yeah.
the program, usually before it. And then John, you got your master's in IO, and now you're currently going for your MBA, correct?
Yeah, I actually just completed my MBA. So I
Completed?
finished.
Oh, round
I
of
finished
applause.
at the end of the year in 23.
Congrats.
So yeah, I now have both degrees in hand. And yeah, I learned about IO in undergrad accidentally, and then I continued on for the MBA later down the line when I sort of wanted to get a better understanding of context in a business.
Awesome. No, well, yeah. First of all, congrats. That's two
Thank
degrees. That's a pretty big step. But for this episode, Brandon and I kind of want to take like the position of students that are about to make this choice, and we're going to kind of ask you guys from the two different perspectives some questions like pertaining to like the two different degrees. So the first question that we want to start out with is more just skill based. So Dr. Islam, to start with you, when you were doing your MBA and then you learned about your degree or learned about a degree in IO psychology, were you thinking in like a different of skill set that you were going to learn, like the skills that you might have learned in your MBA, and then you're like, oh, like maybe these skills in IO might pertain better to me?
Yeah, so the interesting thing is that like when I was the first class I took in my MBA program was organizational behavior, taught by an IO psychologist. And he noticed that I really loved the course, I really enjoyed the material, and he's the one who suggested you should do the master's as well as the MBA. And I wasn't smart enough to like say no. I was just like, oh, that seems like a good idea. Let me just do both. I must have thought it was like a buy one get one free type of sale, which definitely was not how the pricing worked out, because it didn't work out that way. But like the thing that I noticed, the biggest difference that I noticed is that, and I wonder if it's changed actually. So I'm really interested to hear what John has to say since he just completed his MBA. But the MBA is like a generalist degree. It gets you, an idea of what you're going to be doing in an organization, in a business, and how to run a business. So I took like an accounting class. I took a class in management information systems, took a finance course, took a class in entrepreneurship. And, my concentration was HR management. So I took a couple of classes that were specifically HR oriented. And so I think that that's the biggest skill difference is like you're coming out of an MBA program with a generalist view. In IO, the thing that attracted me to IO was the evidence-based approach. It was always, what does the research say? What do you have at hand in terms of the data? How do we make better informed choices? And the tenor of the coursework was really different. I remember that I was in a compensation class with another classmate who was at the time a director of compensation for a very large pharmaceutical organization. So I did my MBA in New Jersey, so there was a lot of pharma people there. And I remember we were on a break, and I was like talking about what we'd learned in class, and the director of comp guy was like, "Yeah, this is all fine. I'm not going to use any of it at work." And I was like, "Oh, really? Like, well, why are you not going to be using any of it at work?" He's like, "Well,
Why
yeah,
here?
like we're here, like, are you not going to be doing this, right?" Like, and he was just like, "No, this is great in theory, but what the actual decisions are made, things are going to be different in the world of business." And the internship that I did during that time really taught me that as well. It's like the big difference between how business runs and what you learned in school, both in the MBA program and the IO program. But the attraction for me was, the IO stuff was more data driven, was more evidence based, and for lack of a better term, and John, you can correct me on this, is MBA stuff was a lot of best practice. It was a lot of, not finance and not accounting, but especially like any of the HR courses that I taken, it was a lot of best practice. The other areas in the MBA, finance, accounting, even MIS and areas like that had really defined outcomes and had really clear boundaries and guidelines. Those courses really taught you like the inner workings of how a business actually runs. So for any students that ever ask me like, "Oh, I want to start my own consulting practice," one of the first things I always suggest is you should learn accounting. It's boring, but it'll teach you everything about how businesses actually function.
Yeah, 100%. And I'll take the mic off that. I would agree. I would say the MBA is still, at least for me, the structure the first year was generalist knowledge, accounting, basic leadership, all those sorts, like basic finance, that type of thing. And then the second year, the way the program was structured was entirely, what do you want to focus on? Where do you want to specialize? I personally chose to specialize in finance and like sort of management. And I avoided sort of the HRE classes because I'm like, okay, like that stuff I know. I already have one degree that covers a lot of that already. And I think in that, like the sequencing, I feel really fortunate in the sense of like, instead of taking an OD class in an MBA and then being like, oh, like maybe I want to do this, and then taking what would be a very much several deeper dives in an IO degree, I felt very very comfortable not taking an OD class from an MBA perspective. And also I had on the note on like compensation and how the in practice and in theory, yeah, that is very much something you see in the day to day. Also, like area of research that I think should be done by IOs, but that's a different soapbox.
We were talking about that last night about the lack of compensation and I guess just like maybe total reward stuff at a PSYOP event or just in IO talks generally. It is an interesting topic, and we know it matters, compensation, but I guess we just don't hear about it a lot. But the part that spoke out to me was the research or the evidence based practice part. Because I feel like everything we do in IO, especially in our classes, has some sort of research backed practice to it. Like everything we write, everything we learn, there's always an article that is supporting some like PowerPoint slides. Did they bring up, John, any sort of research articles in your classes? Like, was there like, what was the difference between that and IO? Like, was it really just all practice?
I would say for the most part it was kind of interesting because I went to NYU Stern, which I will give a huge shout out, fantastic program. That it kind of depended. Sometimes it was best practice, and typically the way research is done in a business school is almost very likely either case studies, where it's case studies to support some sort of best practice narrative, or it's someone who actually spent their academic life researching some things, or it's somebody who's actually been in the field doing. For example, I took a class on distressed asset investing, where it's like companies going under, and the person teaching the class had 30 years of distressed asset investing. So there's no real like research body of, I guess there's like directional research, but it's not like an academic, like here's how you pick, the best distressed company to try to turn around. So I think part of it is for an MBA, like, some of the things are very difficult or very nuanced to research anyways, versus IO where you can actually do things where you can structure a piece of research. So I kind of think like there's kind of a kind of different animal where it's kind of hard to draw a hard comparison there.
In that same vein that like you guys are talking about with skill sets and just what you're learning, one thing that kind of came up to mind, it was kind of a topic you both discussed, was just kind of the way of thinking and how in IO it's a lot more systematic in terms of how the research is done and everything around that. One thing that I wonder, like as students are trying to figure out whether they should do that MBA or they should go for that IO degree, do you think that like people should be weighing, and I'll let you start with this, John, as you just finished with your MBA first or most recently. Do you think people should be weighing the amount of, I guess, like undergrad experience that they have in order to kind of go into one program or the other? So, for example, like an IO, a lot of people kind of come from all around, but in MBA, you kind of see it not, or I guess you could speak to it more, John, like where are people coming from when they get their MBAs and what kind of thought should go into that?
It kind of depends. Yeah, it's a big asterisk depending because there's different programs. Kind of like how IO has part-time and full-time, MBA as well. There's different class profiles depending on the program. I think it's the way I would steer it is I'd flip the question is more what do you want to get out of the program? Because if you want to do cash flow analysis, obviously an MBA, but if you want to do something where you focus on like OD, depending on the type of OD you want to do and the perspective, because someone who wants to do OD can do either an MBA or an IO degree and go into consulting. But the types of work you would do in consulting might be different depending on, are you doing research consulting? Are you doing implementation consulting? So just kind of, and obviously when you're coming out of undergrad, it's hard to know what you want to do, but understand that there's kind of a difference of outcomes, even if there are, and a huge nuance in the populations. Not a helpful answer.
Sorry. No, it was great. And I wanted to ask Dr. Islam kind of like a similar question from a teaching perspective. Do you see a lot of students come in to a master's in IO? Because I feel like Brandon, when we talk to like the other students, we see like people come from everywhere. Like it's different ages, and it's like IO is really like spread out. Do you see that with your students, Dr. Islam?
Yeah, I definitely see students from a lot of different places. I think it's important to look at two things when we think about the difference in who's going into MBA programs versus who's going into IO programs. Number one, MBA programs, the really good ones, want you to at least have 2 years of work experience before you apply. So you need to have worked at least for some portion of time before you apply. Secondly, MBA programs, they vary pretty widely in quality, and where you go, it has a huge impact on a lot of stuff, because when you look at MBA programs, like there's a reason people go to Stern, right? They go to Stern because you're getting a huge network. The branding of the degree really matters. There's a reason that people fight so hard to get into Stanford or to get into MIT or Harvard to do the MBA, because it is a huge differentiator in terms of opportunities that you're going to have. Whereas in IO, it's a little bit closer to traditional psych degrees, where you have a lot of different students from a lot of different backgrounds. Some students coming right out after they've graduated undergrad, they may or may not have any work experience whatsoever. And sometimes they may not even, they haven't even thought about the network that they're getting, right? That they're getting with their, with their education. It's seen as more of like, okay, I'm going to do this degree and then I'm going to get a job and then I'm going to work. And I do see this variation, but I will say that MBA programs have wide variance in terms of experience level, in terms of age, and then some programs, and this is something that if you end up on a executive track in a company, you may end up doing what's called an EMBA or an executive MBA, which is kind of a fast track for senior leaders. And one of the big motivators for doing an MBA is that it at least it used to, the impact of this has actually decreased from what I've seen over time. But the MBA used to be a huge salary differentiator. That if you had the right degree from the right institution, your company, your organization, not only would pay for the degree, but then at the end of it, you would get some sort of salary bump, some sort of increase in pay. And you would, that was something that a lot of people saw over the last, I would say, 15 years or so. That impact has kind of been muted a little bit, mostly because there are a lot more MBA programs of varying quality, and the level of education and the need for that education for you to get into certain areas, I think is maybe decreased a bit.
Yeah, I would echo that as well. Specifically around the sort of decline of the requirement for executive leadership, but I think to some degree there's still like a desire of some sort of advanced degree for that. If not an MBA, usually something else. It's kind of like a resume check versus are you actually using it? Like you'll see people with PhDs in chemistry and executive leadership, that kind of stuff. So yeah, it's sort of like are they quote advanced tier of education, quote money.
Do you think there's any benefit in waiting? Or I mean, it's a lofty claim to say, but like, do you think people should wait? Because I'll take the point of I came right from undergrad and I went right into the master's, and sometimes I wonder, was like, if I went into the business world first and then went back, would I have a different perspective?
And I didn't wait, or I did wait.
And yeah, Brandon was the one who did wait.
I didn't wait because personally I found it impossible to find a job that I would actually want to do with an undergraduate degree in psych. I did not plan ahead, so I went straight on to grad school. And I liked IO. I knew I wanted to do IO. It's not like I shotgunned a bunch of programs and disciplines. I knew I wanted to do IO. But yeah, the market kind of forces you to go that way if you are an undergraduate psych person. And yeah, and I think personally I'm happy I did the MBA later in my career, because I feel like a lot of times when people go straight into an MBA, they do their best to join the most I guess lucrative industries right at the bat, the finance, consulting, etc. And I think just after doing the IO degree, had friends who were either working in finance, I'm like, okay, or consulting or these types of things. I'm like, hey, for me, just observing as an outsider, like that's not the work culture I would personally thrive in. I'm all about a hard day's work, but there's some things that maybe we'll see in a long time, but at least from my peers who were sort of low men on the totem pole, it seemed like very difficult industries to work in. And that's typically,
they need an IO. They need you to,
Well, there are sometimes things that are natures of the industry, and there are IOs working in the industries. However, the industries, somewhat, earn the reputations of which they have.
Sometimes if you're an IO in a particular industry, you're there to facilitate the continued structure of that industry. You're not there to like change it. So like,
you're there to help justify.
Well, there's a very large company that hired a lot of IOs that, in my outsider opinion, doesn't have a great work culture. And I think that what you're there to do is to kind of help people survive the culture and survive the experience. And
it's true. I've seen that too.
I mean, like I worked for a company once where we had high turnover, but that was a feature, not a bug. That was something the company knew. They were like, we don't really care. We're just going to invest more into recruitment, and we're going to bleed people. And the reason we're going to do that is because it's people who get into the company, they're cheaper, and we can keep costs low that way, and we can maintain similar amount of headcount. And that was a relatively ruthless perspective, but it was what the company decided to do.
Yeah, you'll see that like in and general career advice, sometimes an organization is paying a premium to market because they have a difficult culture to thrive in. And that, just size note, is a feature, not a bug. So sometimes when you see like, oh, they're paying so much more than anyone else would for this role, that might be great, or that might be a huge red flag depending on the culture you're going into.
At the large, I feel like that's like at the large tech companies like Apple and Netflix, and I've heard that's the culture that they have. They hire these software engineers and these people that are really good in tech to work for like 2 to 3 years at like top of the line software, whether it's like engineering, and then they know they're gonna just leave and like get some good exit opportunity. I don't know if that's still, and I might have just like heard that off like a Twitter thing, but
I'm not going to call, I don't know any, I can't speak to any specific organization, but there are companies that do design their talent pipelines, like the whole, like it's on in a slide deck or on a spreadsheet somewhere where they actually show like, hey, within our entry level analysts, we assume, we design, not assume, we design, we see this in up and out cultures. We design, by the second year, we would have forced out 20% of them. But they're also going to be working, no matter the 20% forced out or the 80% retained, they're working 80 hours a week. So you do have cultures that are, and systems that are largely designed to function as, let's say, I don't use the word meat grinder, but that's what you will hear them refer to. I think they view it more of like taking coal and pressing into diamonds. Either way, high pressure environment, of which has a high churn by design. High churn, high level of activity, and presumably, and the perspective is this puts a high level of productivity. So the idea is that they have such a a good culture, they pay a premium, they can actually maintain pipelines, and enough people apply where they actually can maintain a stable employee population while having high turnover and high sort of let's call them like interpersonal externalities, where you're actually potentially damaging people through stress or those types of things.
Yeah, and it's not just large organizations. I mean, you might look at your local pizza place, and they've got terrible culture. They've got an owner or manager that's awful at the job and doesn't care if people stay. That's the same general concept. I'll hire somebody. I'll find another teenager that needs a job. And you can actually see with some of the child labor laws that are changing now that they are trying to fill some roles in that way now. So if there's undesirable roles in like a meatpacking factory, or I don't know if anybody's heard about the rule attempts to change rules around truck driver, around truck drivers to get
like last year, like Amazon
year.
Truck drivers getting paid like ridiculous amounts of money. Like, is that what you're talking about?
No, not that they're getting paid, but there are some some lawmakers that are specifically, I remember,
there's
like
a
Idaho
shortage for CDL.
That's right. Trying to get like 17-year-olds or 16-year-olds to be able to drive trucks, long haul trucking, which is because it's a big area of cost. And so if you can't find somebody that's of a particular age to work that job, then guess what? You're going to, you could try to change the law to make that, to make that happen.
You guys are talking about so many different topics that are all so interesting when we talk about like working in different environments. And I think one thing that stood out there that I wanted to kind of press on in terms of MBA versus Masters in IO was the topic of burnout. Like that's something that we've been seeing a lot more lately, and something that I think, especially when Joe and I came into our cohort, was a very large topic of concern. And I want to ask, and Dr. Islam, you can lead on this. Like, what do you see like the conversation difference around burnout versus like in an MBA versus IO program?
I mean, in an IO program, I think we actually we care a little bit more about the actual people. So the people problem of it, especially in an IO program, because so many students want to become coaches, or they really are concerned about how are people doing, can we improve performance this way. And there's a distinct difference between somebody who's interested in a psych degree that ends up going into IO versus somebody who's interested in business who goes in and does an MBA. And the interest of the person, and these are huge general statements, but I think they kind of hold up. Um, the person that goes for the MBA is much more interested in, well, how do I keep the business running? How do I make sure that the employees, I care about their well-being, but not so much that I'm going to, damage the business or damage the finances, or not answer to the shareholders. So if there's a choice between shareholders and the employees, I got to go shareholders. Um, and for the IO who's coming out, fresh IO grad, the care is on is more towards the employee rather than the shareholder. And to a point that John made earlier, eventually, I think if you end up working in consulting, even if you work inside of an organization, due to the demands of how a company or an organization runs and what organizations generally value, you end up getting closer to that. I care about what the shareholders say. I care about what the CEO says. And I want to mitigate or reduce the impact of stress and burnout, but I know that I'm not gonna get it to the level that I might have learned about in grad school. I'm not going to be able to use job characteristics theory to create like this invigorating work that's really going to get everybody, excited. Or I may not be able to, uh, I'm going to be able to mitigate burnout, but I'm not going to be able to stop it completely. And I think that's one of the big differences that we happen to see between people that are going into MBA programs versus somebody who's going into an IO.
Yeah, I think that was said very well. So I'll give you a pat in the back. And I would I would add, also, like, as an IO, you in theory, in the organization, in the context of the organization, keep more big quote bunnies on in theory, have the ability to start putting metrics around burnout. So if burnout is burning out your top 15% of performers, they're doing great. We don't want them to burn out. If that is your corporate culture, back sort of harking against the previously stated group of leadership design. But if you do want to keep the people and you don't want them burning out, it's like, okay, how does burnout translate to a cost? Is burning people out, are we losing some of our best performers because we're overworking them? Can we actually put together like a model to say, hey, if we pull back their hours by X%, or if we do XYZ program or give some sort of benefit like mental health benefit or whatever, can we actually mitigate the risk as generated by sort of other demands in the culture or the organization? So I think that's to continue the train of thought, a cool opportunity that really you can do as an IO, as a psychometrician, that you would not get from an MBA program.
Yeah, one thing I want to mention before we move on about that is, like, you'll notice there's a bunch of different pieces to this, right? One piece is getting people to actually recognize, oh, burnout is happening, and here's the group of that's experiencing burnout. But then, if you look at what organizations actually choose to do to address burnout, a lot of times it's like a wellness training, or maybe it's like, oh, here's an EAP for you that will help, and it's very rarely workload reduction or something like that, and
work redesign.
Yeah. And if you want to see the ultimate example of that, if you look at like the American healthcare system, we know doctors burn out, we know dentists burn out, and we've known it for a really, really long time. You can see it in how medical residents are treated in their training. That there was a rule that medical residents aren't supposed to work over, I believe, 60 hours a week or 70 hours a week, something like that. But if you talk to actual residents, they'll tell you I blow by that number pretty quickly. And that's like just an open secret. It's just the way that is run. But nobody who's in hospital administration will tell you, no, we don't recognize that burnout is a thing. We don't, they understand it both from a psych perspective and a medical perspective. So really getting that buy-in and understanding it is really, really tough.
Yeah, and that I will note that goes back to the previously stated beat grinder terminology throughout earlier, where it's like, if you have X amount of doctors that are in your hospital, you have a hospital with a great reputation, you have tons of applicants coming in to do residency or do whatever, you kind of build that culture, if not by design intentionally, but you have the ability to build it, which is, as an IO, you look at it like, how do we make this better? How do we improve this system? Because you would think there's, externalities. You'd question if there's good patient care, because if someone's burning out, the symptoms and outcomes of burnout is quality of care is probably going to decline as a result. So you actually, in theory, have the ability to set an argument to sort of re-steer it. But then again, that goes to who is the owner, who's the fiduciary, who's the shareholder, what's the actual incentive model and the governance of the organization.
Do you think you'd actually ever even be able to change that culture? Like if you come in as an IO and you're like, yeah, they're burning out, they're working too hard, or like think of like an investment banking culture where you're like, well, we should really have them like working less, but they know that they should be working less, but they don't want to like leave the office because then it like looks bad. Like, how do you change a culture like that won't ever really change because of like the implication if I like work less?
I'll jump in. It's who is responsible for the culture. So if the culture, you got to start with who's actually traditionally it's, the CEO, but like, okay, well, who's the CEO responsible to? CEO is responsible to the board. Okay, who's the board responsible to? Assuming they have a board. Board is responsible to the shareholder, or to the trust, or to the whomever. It might actually be independently owned by the CEO. So you would start with convincing that party, because that party actually owns the chain of responsibility from the top. I think there's a lot of hope around bottoms up approaches, but when it comes to the where the rubber meets the road, you got to look at where the end of that decision chain is.
Yeah, I'll add one more thing, and this is going to sound really Machiavellian, but if you're working internally inside of an organization, you need power. And I mean, we talk about power and leadership, right? In leadership course, you're like, hey, here's the different areas of power, but we never really talk about it in, with IO students from like a consulting standpoint. Like, hey, you need power to make things happen, and you need influence to make things happen. And even if you have a great deck with great data with great numbers, they can be ignored if you don't have influence. And so working on those soft skills, which to be honest, IO students usually have and can develop and can hone. That was one of the big wake up calls after I graduated from both my master's and my PhD, was how much soft skills and power were really needed to get things done within an organization. And so if you're a student that's thinking about really making change within an organization, figuring out where and how to maneuver around power within the organizations is extremely important.
Yeah, and to that note, for the most part, you're not going to be an executive or a chief, whatever, for many years into your career. So a big part of being successful in it is to Sai's point, how do you influence in a way that positively moves the organization forward, coming from a position not of power, but from a position of advisement, or a position of analytic, or a position of whatever your seat is.
Actually, John, that reminds me of something. I will say that the MBA programs are really open about that. I think they're much more open about like how the the nitty gritty of like how the organization actually works. And the IO students, I think sometimes when you come out, you're a little more starry eyed than the MBA.
I would agree with that.
Except for our alumni. The alumni tell us.
Yeah, well, the alumni they learned firsthand through the hard knocks.
So for one of our final questions, we wanted to pick your brains about is why we try to think of the things we want to learn in a degree. We've all been a student before, and you're like, I'm paying for this degree. Where is it going to take me? Why am I paying $60,000 and just to get some random job? I want to, be successful, and I want to do well in my future. In your opinion, do you think industries, or maybe different industries, look at these degrees differently? Maybe in the past, I know IO wasn't as big, so maybe MBA was a bit more popular among recent graduates looking for jobs. But I guess more now currently, or looking towards the future, do you think there's going to be a difference in the degrees held between students? We can start with you, John.
I think it depends on the industry. To your point, do industries value? It depends on the industry entirely. Like if you're gonna, let's say you have an IO degree or an MBA and you go into consulting, you can probably make partner with either degree without, I would say, and maybe Cy will disagree, but I would argue the partner track would probably look the same for an MBA and an IO, because that's largely, how are you influencing the organization? Are you selling services to clients, etc.? I would say that that's not a difference. I think that IO has a more of a challenge from a sales standpoint, where there's industries that just don't know what IO is, but they can tell what an MBA is. Also, like as an IO, it's unlikely that you're going to take like an ops path to leadership or a finance path to leadership. Like you're kind of not pigeonholed, but there's sort of fewer places where you can play. But they are deeply interesting because you do go in for a deeper set of knowledge, to Cy's point around OD earlier in the conversation. So it just really depends on what you want to do, and then how you sell yourself over the course of your career, and how do you actually build your professional reputation.
No, it's a great point. I'm hoping that in the future that IO becomes a bit more. I feel like it will too, and it already is becoming more.
Yeah, 100%.
Like more people are learning about it. We actually just had a great episode with Vicky Walia about IO and finance, and Brandon and I have been talking. We want to try to have more about not like about the finance industry, but just financial knowledge that IOs can hold. And I think, John, that we've talked about it before, that it's an important skill that IOs should have, because when you work in the business world, things cost money, and I can't just create stuff and then just implement it without.
Yeah, no, sorry, to clarify, I mean like working in like the finance industry, not actually doing finance. So it's like like that's the difference. It's like you're not going to join a financial services firm and be a run an account. Like you're going to be working within the HR, within the financial services industry. So to clarify that.
All right. So to kind of follow up on that, Dr. Nolan and I did some research on exactly this question about what whether people understood or knew, and what we found was that the MBA was much more closely associated with traditional business type jobs. Like people just associated, well, I know what an MBA is. It's got business in the name, so it's got to be associated with business. And because IO psychology has the word psychology in its name, it's much closer to things like counseling or mental health, things that we traditionally think of as being psychology. And if you guys want, I'll share the link to that paper, because I think it's interesting to know. The thing that it comes down to, I think, for anybody, whether you're an MBA or an IO, I think maybe the barrier to entry into a job might be a little lower for an MBA, though because of so many more MBAs that are out there, I wonder about the efficacy of the degree. Really depends on where you went to school in many cases. But no matter what, I think you have to be able to identify some core skills that you actually have that you bring to the table. And I've had a lot of conversations with IO students over the last 6 to 9 months as the economy seems to be slowing down a little bit. And one consistent theme that I've found is I keep telling students to expand their idea of what an IO job is. One of the challenges in teaching in a master's program is you get caught up in talking about corporate HR, corporate talent development all the time. But there's lots of other jobs that you can do, right? You can do a job in evaluation. You can just go full on data analytics if that's something you're interested in. You can go the other route and do performance coaching, do facilitation. So really, for anybody who's thinking about pursuing one of these degrees, I would look at what you're going to be learning and then think about what skills you want to kind of add to that skill set, and then where you think you might want to work, what kind of work you're most passionate about, and then just kind of like build towards that. Because right after you get the degree, I don't think you're necessarily immediately going to leapfrog into the job and the career that you immediately want. Everybody starts at the bottom rung and has to work their way up, unless you're already established in your career and you're doing one of these degrees, and it's a way to either check the box or transition into another area. That was one thing I noticed in my MBA and also in my IO program, is that people were doing these degrees to kind of leave careers that they had previously, and they were thinking about moving someplace else. So, I've been working in finance. I don't really like it. I want to start my own business. So I'm going to do an MBA in entrepreneurship. Or, I have been working in, marketing all this time. I'm more interested in the human element of things. I want to do a master's in IO. So having that vision for yourself is, I think, just as important as thinking about what the degrees actually offer.
Yeah, definitely understand where you want to be after it as you're thinking about applying in either direction.
Yeah, I will say too that I think you guys bring up a lot of great points, and I'm going to bring up this topic and I might regret it because we'll talk about it a lot, but I just want to ask because I think it's important. There's a lot of like masters in IO programs that are coming up, as we kind of discussed a little bit offline, and I know we all kind of see it. Like, do you guys think that with that coming to fruition, where there's all these MAIO programs and like it's going to become almost similar to how an MBA is oversaturated, do you think that that could be something that could be seen, where there's like a lot of MAIOs and then there's a lot of MBAs, and like having just that degree might not go as far as it used to? Like, what are your guys' thoughts on that? Because I think students might need to hear that.
Well, you guys already know that I keep telling people not to do PhDs, right? I keep saying, like, you don't need to do a PhD to have a career. And actually, there is current SIOP president Tara Barron wrote in her column in Tip, wrote about the influx of all of these new programs that are coming up of varying quality. And that's some of that SIOP can't really take care of, just because they're not they're not in the business of certifying programs and looking at their quality. And there's a larger conversation about what government should do in terms of like certifying organizations, and even certifying agencies like middle states and things like that. They're not really telling people like, oh, this is a bad program, where you shouldn't go here. They'll just pull their certification. There's no certifying body that'll stop anybody from starting a master's in IO program. And so for students that are listening, you need to do your research, and that means doing more than just Googling. And that means, so just to put this into context, when I was looking at PhD programs, I went out of my way to find students to talk to. And I chose Hofstra because the students were the happiest out of the 25 or 30 schools that I'd looked at, and of the 12 to 15 that I applied to, they were definitely the happiest out of all the ones that I got a chance to speak to. And that made a difference. That told me that this was a program that I would get something out of. And if I hadn't done that, I feel like I might have made some poor choices. And I think that happens a lot, especially students that are low SES or maybe don't have as much background, especially first time college grads, first time masters applicants. They may not have the frame of reference to really be able to tell the difference between a not great program and a good program. The one really great thing about the MBA is people talk about reputation of schools very clearly. IO, we talk about it, but like these are the top PhD programs. These are sort of the top master's programs, but there's a large swath of students that don't ever think about or get a chance to think about that.
Yeah.
No, it makes sense. I remember when I was applying to clinical and school psychology programs, they have like, I think it's like NASP or something like that, and it's like accredited programs, and that's what I followed. I was like, if I'm going to go to this, because I remember getting emails, and I was like, oh, this is cheap, and this looks cool, and someone's smiling on the pamphlet, and then I looked it up, and I was like, I don't even know if this is a real school. Like, I'm just sending my money to a foreign account.
Yeah, because like I would echo that. Like I think when I was applying, there were maybe 20 schools I could find, and now there's a couple hundred. If not, maybe 150, maybe a couple hundreds rounding up hard. But like there's a lot of options, and they're all less than 10 years old. So even if the university has a good reputation, it's hard to tell if the program is a strong program. And from on the flip side, from a hiring perspective, I don't know. Like like I have no idea. And I really don't have a way of knowing which program outside the ones that I was familiar with when I was in grad school, what their talent philosophies are, how do they prepare people, how do they like, how strong is their network, etc. So I would echo, do your research, talk to people, per what Sai said, because there's just a lot.
Yeah.
Talking to students is probably one of the best like things you can do. I think I talked to a couple of students. We have a couple of student episodes you guys can listen to. Look for it in the links. But it is it's one of the best ways to gauge, I would say, the culture and like the legitimacy of the program. Brandon, would you say did you reach out to anybody when you were applying? Like, how did you figure out Hofstra was the place?
So I'm one of the few who got in very late to Hofstra. It was kind of on a whim. I reached out to more faculty that were at Hofstra, and that was kind of how I got my gauge. But I got in 3 weeks before the program started, so there really wasn't much time to move across the country and figure out if I was going to like it or not. But I think, though, I do want to say that Dr. Islam and John, you guys both mentioned, I think, a lot of great stuff about, and it's like a good note for us to end on, about just the idea of like when you're looking for a program, you've got to make sure you do your own research. And I think that that's like probably the number one takeaway. If I had to take one from this episode, it would be that, like, especially when measuring MBA versus MAIO, like doing your own research on both ends of the spectrum is something that's super important when trying to figure out what's the best career for you, and talk to people who have gone through the process already. I think that you guys really echoed that sentiment very well, and I think that's going to be really helpful for a lot of students.
Yeah, I think that's great. And one thing I want to mention, I think John did a great job of this when he was in grad school, and I think Joe, Brandon, I think you're both doing a great job of this too, is you're maximizing the benefit of the program. You're getting the most out of the program that you're in. So sometimes, you can do all the research and all the thinking and thinking about the MBA versus the MAIO, but whatever program you end up in, just try to get the most out of it. One thing that I found was that just by telling people what my career goals were, what my interests were, and being clear about that, I got additional opportunities, right? And I think that's really, really helpful, is to take advantage of as much as what the program offers, and moving forward with that.
Yeah, I would echo that. Talk to people. Reach out to alumni. Go to networking events. All that stuff. Just because, like, it's not like you don't know who these people are, but also like they have their own networks. And if you're like, oh, I really like, I don't know, neural networks, and then someone's like, oh, well, I know somebody who's doing XYZ with neural networks. I'll connect you guys. Like, yeah, just meet people.
Yeah, absolutely. People are looking to help.
Oh yeah, especially.
That's Dr. Islam helped me get my internship. I probably said that here before too. We met John. Maybe John was on LinkedIn. I forget what the first.
I met John on PsyOp.
Yeah, at PsyOp. Yeah. Yeah.
Oh, well, look at us now. But it's definitely some great points you guys brought up. This is like the first episode we had about MBA versus IO that I think they can really listen to and like gauge like what matters to them most and like what program to apply for. So thank you guys for coming on. We appreciate you sharing your expertise.
My pleasure. Yeah, thanks for having us.
Thank you for having us.
Yeah,
bye guys.
All right, so that was such a treat to get to like chat with both Dr. Islam and John. Like, I feel like, we get to talk to them more often than a lot of people do in our program, and I always feel so lucky because I feel like every time I walk away with some sort of new thing that I learned that I didn't know before.
I always love talking to them. Even just like before, after the podcast, during, like, it's always just great to hear their expertise because they've had so many different types of experiences. Like, it's just valid information. Like, I know I'm getting good stuff.
Yeah, no, really. And on top of that too, it's just like that type of, I guess, relationship that they have. It's like a student and in somebody who's like gone through the program. And like I feel like that's kind of how I hope that you and I can kind of build relationships, and others can kind of learn from that to like build relationships within their IO programs, so that you like get close with your professors, get close with your alumni, like being able to do that type of stuff. And not only that, like leverage the knowledge they have. Like Joe and I are so lucky, like we get to talk to them and talk to a bunch of other alumni that give us more than like we could ever ask, like information wise. And like luckily we get to share it with everybody.
No, absolutely. And the good thing about it is that we don't do anything special. Like you guys can do this too. The way we get people on the podcast, we just message them out of the blue. So there's no secret. There's no secret sauce to it. Go ahead, and I bet you definitely won't be sorry you did it. But thank you as always for listening, and we'll catch you guys next Friday.
Yep, catch you guys next week.